welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. Today we have on Chuck Thompson. He's the author of the widely reviewed political screed, Better Off Without Him, a Northern Manifesto for Southern Secession. His writing has appeared in Outside, Politico, Esquire, Men's Journal, New Republic, and many other publications. He's the writer and executive producer of the Paramount Plus three-part music documentary, Sometimes When We Touch, The Reign, Ruin, and Resurrection of Soft Rock. And his newest book, available now, is called The Status Revolution, the improbable story of how the lowbrow became the highbrow. Welcome, Chuck. It's good to have you on.
Thanks a lot. Good to be here, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in his book, Chuck wrote, culture is never static. It changes with the times and the moods of the people who create and consume it. What once seemed vulgar and lowbrow can become chic and highbrow in the blink of an eye, and vice versa. But the most enduring works of art, regardless of their status, are those that speak to the human experience in a profound and lasting way. So I really love that. And what that kind of tells us is that whatever is popular is essentially, it's essentially changing, right? It's changing, and it's not necessarily of any particular intrinsic value. And I think where a lot of us kind of get stuck when we think of, like, let's say luxury items, work of art or whatever, right, is I think that we get stuck on this notion that they are inherently worth something. And so when you talk about in your book, you talk about kind of the evolution of status and how it sort of shifted in the early part of the 20th century and where it is now, right? Which obviously tells us that maybe it's not as enduring, or the kind of value, or maybe some of the inherent value isn't as enduring as we would like to think. So can you kind of take us through that evolution and sort of how that's changed and what was once considered to be of high class or of high status, and how it's kind of shifted into more, I don't know, what would you call it? It's more kind of basic now, or more sort of seen as sort of, it's more repugnant to many people now, right? And sort of how that shifted into other areas that are now conceived of as being of high status.
Well, I think the first point that you kind of touched on is that status is always going to be a reflection of societal values. And as societal values change, the markers of status and what is considered, prestigious or a status symbol is going to change along with those shifting values. I start with very briefly, I give a very brief recap of the way status has been reflected through society, particularly Western society, but not exclusively. For most of the run of Judeo-Christian civilization, status has been looked upon as something that's kind of sinful, or as a moral failing of people that, particularly in a Christian church or clergy, that might have discouraged the accumulation of wealth or goods and extolled the virtues of poverty and things like that. In a society that's clearly dominated by those values, any sort of reaching for status is going to be looked at as a moral failing, as one of the seven deadly sins, greed and sloth and these kind of things. But the real jump, I think, for me, and that gets really interesting is right, basically with the Industrial Revolution, and we suddenly have this hyper-consumer society that's just building and building, and we have kind of the model of finance capitalism taking over. And the real big marker of status early on comes in a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class by an economist named Thorstein Veblen. That book came out in 1899. And Veblen, was this real social critic of status seeking and wealth accumulation in the consumer age. And this is going to sort of lay the foundation for this revolution that I'm feeling that we're in now. But just by the title of his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, Veblen essentially defined status and what he saw reflected in the society. The ultimate expression of status was an almost aristocratic abundance of leisure time. Someone who did not have to work was the pinnacle, the finance capitalist, the person who just sat back in his or her mansion and estate and whatever horseless carriage perhaps he had, running around, early Benz or something, that this was the person that defined status. You do not have to work, right? The woman who wore the corset, or the Chinese woman whose feet were bound, really to show that she did not have to labor in the rice fields, or these types of things. Veblen remains really influential to this day. And there are a lot of people out there that will tell you, people who study this more even than I have, sociologists, economists, that Veblen remains kind of the touchstone for all discussions about status in Western society. I think that's totally wrong. I think Veblen's really problematic for a lot of reasons, but his book and his words, were only strengthened by guys like in the middle of the 20th century. John Kenneth Galbraith wrote The Affluent Society, which was another critique of affluence and consumerism. Vance Packard, who wrote The Status Seekers in the 1950s, was a journalist who was really popular and really influential. He coined that term, status seeking. And again, these guys basically took Veblen's message of status seeking is bad, it's wrong, it shows a corrosive element in society. Packard took it a step further to say that people who engaged in status seeking were mere dupes of kind of Madison Avenue advertising sharks, that you're kind of a pawn of big marketing, so to speak, that all these impulses that you're feeling to upgrade your car, to keep up with the Joneses, to keep your lawn nice, to get a better job, to dress well, to get the best purebred dog, that these were all artificial impulses that were essentially created, or at least manipulated by advertising and marketing sharks. So that's kind of where most people, I think, even today, if you look down, it's a sort of status seeking is kind of a pejorative term, right? So the big shift, and I feel like I'm talking a little bit long here, guys, but
no, it's okay. Because I asked about the evolution, so that's actually on me. It's okay. Yeah, please keep going.
I'm summarizing the first three chapters of the book, right? A couple big shifts happen about in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. And I think, especially, I sort of define that the shift in status and the way we view status is happening on 4 levels. And there's sort of 4 primary forces, one of which is scientific breakthroughs that provide us with a completely new understanding of how the brain processes status. And I can, talk in depth about that if you like, because I think it's really interesting, and I think it's one of the big changers. Functional magnetic resonance imaging is one of the biggest. We kind of look at the brain as it processes status, and we can see that status is actually a measurable biological function. Another one is in terms of luxury marketing. These multinational corporations that have swallowed all of these small family-owned luxury brands, which were the pinnacle of consumer society status, right? All these were these small, tiny little brands producing, a limited quantity of their luxury goods year after year. They've all been swallowed up by these big corporate entities. And these big luxury brands now are needing to find new ways to market and sell luxury products in a world that's become glutted with luxury products, and in which there's now 4 or 5 titanic companies that are doing battle for market share. That was not what luxury goods were about 50 years ago at all. The world of academia has really changed. Academia, in universities, colleges, whatnot, is a place where ideas about status, prestige, and value in society are studied, they're measured, and they're conveyed to society. And the world of academia is fundamentally different now than it was in Thorstein Veblen's days, or even than it was in the 1960s or 70s. It's much more feminized, and it's much more diverse. And that is having a really profound effect on the types of studies that are carried out, who carries them out, the conclusions that are drawn. And finally, there are, I think, particularly in the last 5, 10, 15 years, these sort of social equality and justice movements that are driving concepts of inclusivity while challenging our traditional definitions of privilege, who has it, how did they get it, who should have it, and wealth and things like that. So I think those are 4 big drivers of the changes that we're seeing.
What's fascinating is that originally, when one might have thought of what is status, or what does high status look like, right? You'd imagine somebody who's incredibly rich, like you said, doesn't have to work, right? But what's interesting is that due to those corrosive elements that you're discussing, right? Like via marketing, right? Creating these artificially sort of created impulses that sort of make us want things that, automatically now convey status, where otherwise before they didn't, right? So what's interesting is, referring to even, like, let's say the academia, right? Virtue signaling, right? Like, for example, if you virtue signal, now that's a way to convey status, right? Whereas before you had to be rich or something like that. But now there's other ways to sort of gain that status, and people are sort of more or less we could say falling for it, right?
Right. It kind of went from a sort of I'm better than you because I have more money than you to I'm better than you because I'm a better person than you are.
Yeah.
Well, you can certainly gain a certain type of social capital by doing that. I think what you're sort of getting at in a roundabout way, and that I think
Yeah.
is pretty interesting, is I've done a couple interviews for this book where people might ask, well, what is status? And you know, I could and you could look up the definition of status in the dictionary, but the real answer right now is that no one knows for sure.
Hmm.
And I think that's what's really interesting, and that's part of what I've termed this status revolution. I mean, for a variety of reasons, our collective ideas of status and prestige and privilege are in this real state of flux, right? And as I said before, it's kind of a reflection of society and its values. So if you ask 10 Americans right now, what is the United States? You'll get 20 different answers, right? So because we're in this state of social upheaval, right? And this is kind of being reflected in our shifting concepts of status and how we perceive ourselves in relation to others. But you're right. I mean, in terms of Veblen and in terms of this glut of affluence and not having to work and leisure time, um, you know, right now I think how indispensable someone is to their work cohort defines them just as much as where they go on vacation. Right,
Right.
in this kind of hustle culture, how much you are needed. It's not just how much money you have, it's how hard you work for it, how many network connections you have, right? How many people depend on you and listen to you, things like that. So you can gain that status without having a whole ton of money.
Yeah.
What's interesting? So I'm curious, what exactly maybe prompted you to write the book? Is it that you see that the status, what defines status, or what somebody can do to gain status is in constant flux? Is that it, or is it that we care so much about status and that's sort of a corrosive part of our nature, and then you're highlighting that so that we become more aware of it? Like, what exactly is your motivation?
Well, I have to admit, I've always been a little bit confused by status and not really cared about the traditional markers of it. Many years ago, I walked through St. Mark's Square in Venice, Italy, when I was on vacation, and it was great. And architecture is fantastic, and Venice is amazing. And I looked around at all these designer shops that lined this plaza, right, St. Mark's, this almost holy place. And I thought, who comes all the way to Venice to buy the same overpriced crap and suit and necklace and watch that I can buy in Denver or Seattle or Nagoya, Japan, or I was like, why? Who the hell would come all the way here and do this? I grew up in a tourist town in Juneau, Alaska, and the main tourist drag is lined with luxury jewelry shops. Like what the, I don't know how much swearing we're doing on that show here,
Oh, you
but
can curse all you want, all you
okay.
want.
Anyway, I've always been really bored with these ideas of, I never watched Pimp My Ride or MTV Cribs or any of that. It's just like
Yeah.
the lifestyles of the rich and famous. I never cared about that stuff. And so, but I still recognize that status is obviously it's an important driver in everyday life.
Right.
So I wanted to kind of look at that. And so what I would say is, this is not, and I say it in the book, this isn't a book about famous designer brands or orgies of overindulgence or things like that. There's a little bit of that in here for sure. I mean, you
Yeah.
have to get into that a little bit. But, for example, I wanted to find places where status was important, but being reflected in different ways, right? That's why I went up to this First Nations village in British Columbia to watch this totem carver who was engaged in this project to sort of reestablish status in his village by carving a totem pole. A guy in southern Italy, Paolo Scudieri, who I wanted to go see, who had become a titan of the luxury car industry, but didn't start that way and really sort of did so as a means, at least according to him, to bring social justice to what he considered his downtrodden people of his community in southern Italy. Of course, he got pretty wealthy along the way himself, and I think he'd admit that. But nevertheless, according to him, that was his driving motivation. And the more I kind of met people like this, I realized that there are very few people who are at the top of the status game and who are now these big influencers in status started that way. They don't tend to be silver spoon kids. Some of them do. Of course, there's exceptions to everything. But that's why that sort of gets to the subtitle of the book, which is how the lowbrow became the highbrow, the unlikely story of how the lowbrow became the highbrow. Because it is kind of this constant battle, for what, between sort of challengers to the status quo status and those on top. And so I guess all of these things answer your question. It's a bit of a roundabout answer, Alan, but I knew that status was important and valued, almost to the extent of money, really, in this society. And yet I wasn't quite sure why I didn't care about the traditional markers of status. And I found out through the researching this book that I'm not alone in that. Most people are kind of like me.
Right. Yeah, and I could see that social media must definitely have a huge impact on what people view as popular or status worthy, right? Especially marketers are using, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all that to market to people, right? So I could see how that can shift very quickly, right? What's popular now? It just takes another person or another entity making something go viral, right? To perhaps make that a status worthy symbol for people to try to obtain. So
I think social media, the zeitgeist that says exposure and clicks and influence are more important than salary in a lot of ways, right? And I think this also gets to a point which is a little confusing, that we kind of automatically conflate wealth with status. And certainly money and, rich people and all that, and lots of nice possessions and a luxury yacht can indeed be a reflection of your status in your community or society. That is true. But it's not the only one. We don't have to think of a lot of money equaling a lot of status all the time. The real basic example is a clergy, a religious person who might take a vow of poverty. The Pope gets no salary, right? Officially, the Pope makes no money. But clearly the Pope has a hell of a lot of status within the Catholic Church and even beyond. Think of the captain of a high school sports team, basketball team, football player, quarterback, whatever. He or her might have a ton of status within that high school community. Right? Writers are conferred status, right? We're often asked to dispense our wisdom on podcasts like this one, but as I like to say, there's a good reason they often say of writers, he died penniless.
Yeah, and just in thinking about it in terms of psychology, so I know you mentioned the neuroscientific aspect of it, which I really want to get into. So you have like somebody like, let's say, Jordan Peterson, right? So he would say, well, status seeking is pretty natural, that like human hierarchies are natural. So I don't really know how true that is, but what I do know is in terms of the psychological research, and this is something I often focus on in my writing, pride, self-esteem. Usually those things aren't exactly the same, but sometimes the two concepts are conflated, where the idea is like pride is sort of a form of self-esteem in the sense of like you build up enough pride that kind of equates to or amounts to your self-esteem on the whole, right? So when we think about sort of what makes us feel good and what's related directly or most directly to mental health, it's actually pride, and it is status. It's feeling good about yourself, feeling good about your group, and your groups could be several, right? You could identify with several groups. But the interesting part of that is that there's this sort of downside to status, is that automatically, and this is where I think Peterson's idea comes in, is that whether or not hierarchies are natural, I think comparison is natural. So when you think about, let's say, if I'm thinking of myself, or let's say our podcast, let's take this for instance, right? So if I think of our podcast, and even though this is not true, let's say I'm like, oh, our podcast is like one of the best podcasts in the country, right? So let's say that's the case. Automatically, I'm already comparing myself downward, right? And I'm saying, okay, here are these other podcasts that are clearly not anywhere near where we are. So when we think about status and pride, I think it's so hard to kind of disconnect that. So on the one hand, you're saying, okay, status and pride and self-esteem, they're related to mental health and mental well-being. But on the other hand, they're also related to a lot of intergroup conflict. And so we had psychologist David Myers on, and he's really big on this. And he says, well, pride is actually not that great, even though, yes, in the short term, it does build up your self-esteem. In the long term, it kind of contributes to war and sort of destruction and conflict or whatever. So ultimately, we have to kind of revisit it, right? So, so in your work, what have you found about sort of more about the kind of beneficial elements of status, both psychologically, communally, personally, interpersonally, and then what about some of the destructive elements of it too?
Well, Leon, first of all, I was told this was one of the best podcasts in the country. Being honest.
Yeah, we're going to make a clip of that. I love it.
I wouldn't be here if not for that. Well, look, I can't claim to have done the same amount of research that, clinical psychologists and whatnot, maybe some of your other guests have had. But what I can say is that, well, to answer your question, I guess maybe a friend of mine read the book and said, well, I liked your book, but he goes, I had the real problem. I said, I kind of hear you saying, greed is good inevitably with this stuff, right? And I said, I don't think I said greed is good. I said, or that status is good or greed is good. I think I said status is inevitable. And that's kind of what I've come to believe by talking to guys like Stephen Quartz at Caltech, who did a great book called Cool. I forget Annette Ask was his co-writer. I forget his the subtitle of that book, but I try to, I'm not really putting value, and this might be a disappointing answer for you guys, but I tried to go through this book and not really put a value judgment on what I was finding to be true about status or not. I was just trying to say, these are the people that are influencing status, that are driving our communal understanding of status, that are driving a sea change in the way that academia and corporations and whatnot, social movements see status. And again, I kind of go back to this, my little catchphrase on one of these is that status is no longer sin, it's biology.
Yes.
Now that gets to your question of, are these natural functions or not? Are hierarchies, and maybe you've had people on the show that have argued against this. I mean, I mean, the best thing to do is look at any animal kingdom, right? Social hierarchies are developed very quickly within any animal kingdom. So as long as that we're going to accept that we're really part of the animal kingdom and we're just primates, we might do this on a little bit more intelligent or sophisticated scale. But I think all of that sophistication, intelligence just masks a biological drive. And the interesting thing for that to me was one of the studies that I really liked, and it's been written about before, but a woman named Hilke Plassman did in 2011 at Caltech. There was one of these kind of neat studies. I always like these psych studies where they kind of have a little feint and they don't really tell, the subject to the guy who's administering this electric shock to the person doesn't realize that he or she's the one that's actually the subject of the test. So she did this test about using to find out how people reacted to differently priced bottles of wine, like an expensive wine, a cheap wine, and a sort of mid-level wine. So she did this experiment where she had, 30 or 40 people come in, and they were using this functional magnetic resonance imaging, right? They put them in an MRI machine. And they told the subjects that we're going to try to test the sort of digestive properties of 3 different types of wines. And we're going to we're hooking you up to see how these things affect how you process, food or whatever the feint was. So they would give these people like a bottle of wine, glass of wine, or a sip of wine, and say, well, this is this $5 bottle of cab that we bought at Trader Joe's down the street, and they have them drink it. And they were measuring what was going on in their brain at the same time. And then they would say, well, this is kind of a mid-price. This is a $25 bottle of wine that's come from this wine shop, in Midtown or whatever. And then they say, well, here's this $150 wine that, we imported a limited supply directly from the chateau in France, right?
Yeah.
And what they noticed was that when people were sipping what they thought was the high-priced wine, their sort of dopamine and endorphins just went bananas, right? Just went bonkers, just lit up. And when they were drinking the cheap wine, they were just kind of dormant, didn't do anything. The mid-priced wine maybe a little bit. Of course, what the subjects didn't know, they were drinking the same wine every time. Right? So the reactions to the wine were simply how much they thought it cost, and therefore this association with status or prestige, right? And so what this study proved to Plassman and her team, and as well as to me, I was convinced, I read the whole study a couple times before writing about it in the book, was that expensive, it's really, we all love to critique the wine snob who can't even, right, the sommelier when blindfolded or when given a choice of wines in paper bags, can't distinguish the $150 estate, vintage limited run to the $5, Texas Plonk that they get, right? Everybody loves laughing at that stuff. But what this proved is that actually people do like expensive wine more. Expensive wine does make people feel better than cheap wine, not for the reasons that it tastes better or has a better, mouthfeel or whatever kind of stuff that they want to come up with. But because in associating it with a lot of status, they literally are feeling better, right? They're getting more dopamine and all that stuff. So to me, that shows that this is a biological function, right? It's not something that's created. Now, you can't say, and maybe one of your, and I'm Leon, I'm looking at your face and I'm hearing your next question, which is, that doesn't prove that it's necessarily biological. Our society may have created that sort of.
Actually, I agree with you. I actually don't. I actually agree with you. Oh, wait, I actually want to tell you guys an interesting story. So because like we were assholes as like teenagers and like whatever it was, whatever comes after teenager, like as young adults, I guess, right? So check this story out. Oh my God. So we're at this house party, right? And like again, we're assholes, and of course we're super competitive because that's what guys do. And so there's like this really good-looking guy there, right? And his girlfriend is like stunning. So we're like, oh my God, like fuck this guy, right? So we have 2 bottles of liquor with us, right? So one is a really expensive bottle of Hennessy. The other is this garbage liquor called John Bar. So John Bar is so terrible that literally, first of all, it tastes like shit, number one. But second of all, it resembles Johnny Walker, but just in the labeling because they have to sell this garbage, right? And it also, I think, came in a plastic bottle too, which was crazy, right? So this guy, right, he's like, oh, hey guys, can I come drink with you? We're like, oh yeah, sure, man, whatever. So he sits down and he's like, oh, what are you guys drinking? Oh, Hennessy, right? And so now me and my friend kind of look at each other and we're like, oh, let's start fucking with him. So we're like, yeah, man, but like you can't have the Hennessy. No, I'm sorry. So we're like, yeah, you can have the Hennessy, but you can't have the John Bar. And he's like, oh, why? And we're like, because it's really expensive, man. I mean, if you want, you can chip down. It's like, $50 a person. And so he says, wow, really? He's like, I'm a bartender. I've never even heard of it. We're like, yeah, honestly, we wouldn't have expected you to, but that's all right. Just drink the Hennessy, right? So this guy's like, he's taking the shots at the Hennessy and he's like sitting there looking at that bottle. And so we're like, you want to have a shot? And he's like, shit, man, I didn't want to be a dick, but like, yeah, I like really want to try it. And we're like, dude, should we just let him have a shot? And my friend was like, fine, whatever, let him have a shot, just one shot. He's like, all right. So we're taking the shot, right? We take the shots of John Bar. We take it together and he's like, oh my God, man, this is like really fucking smooth. And we're like, yeah, obviously it's John Bar. And he's like, no, man. He's like, yo, I don't think I've ever tasted anything like this. And we're like, yeah, I know. So he's like, shit, man, like, can I have another? And we're like, oh, dude, like, come on, no. So we're like, no, we're cutting you off, right? So then his friend comes, right? And his friend comes and he sits down. He's like, oh, when you guys drinking? And we're doing the same shit to his friend. And we're like, oh, you can have the Hennessy. And he's like, why? What's that other thing? And his friend was like, yo, bro, I just had it. It's like the most amazing fucking whiskey in the world. And we're like, nah, dude, like, come on, man. You guys aren't even going to chip down. You're going to talk about it. No, we're not letting you have it. So his friend is like, all right, man. He's like, look, not to be a dick, but can I just have one shot? Fine, whatever, man. Just take one shot. And so, we're all doing the shots of John Bar. His friend's like, fuck, man, you're right. Yo, holy shit, where did you guys get this stuff? We're like, no, we're never going to tell you. So, like, literally, as we're going through the night, these guys are, like, consistently talking about it. But what's so great about these studies is that it shows how, like, susceptible the human mind is to bullshit, right? So why I actually agree with you, Chuck, is that I actually think in terms of status, it's not the wine per se that's making people feel the dopamine rush, right? It's their interpretation, like what CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, would say. It's the interpretation of what that wine means and what that wine means about me. So that wine says about me that I am somebody of high worth, high value, high status. So therefore, I now feel good about it. So here's what I assume happened with these guys. I think they took the shot and they were like, oh my God, like here's this exclusive thing that these guys won't even let me drink on. So clearly, right, because they're giving me this liquor, that must mean I'm important. That must mean I'm valuable, I'm worthy. So clearly the sort of dopamine hit enhanced the taste of the liquor. So yeah, I agree with you. I'm sure that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, and well, I love that story because it's basically a real world example of that experiment that Plasman and her team carried out at Caltech, 10, 11 years ago. And so, yeah, I guess the lesson from my book, Leon, would be not to laugh at those guys anymore, right? Yeah. Or not to laugh at what dumb shits they were or how, what weak-minded fools they were.
Yeah.
That John, what was it? John Bar?
John Bar, yeah. And by the way, and we also did it because of status seeking, because in some ways, because we felt inferior to him, because we're like, here he is with this hot girl. Yeah, here he is with this hot girl. We got to put him in his place. We got to show him that we're better than him. And we felt that we were.
I actually was hoping that you're going to say you made him pay for it.
No. We didn't go that far. We didn't go that far. We're like, okay, that's pretty. Dude, that bottle costs like $15 for like a gallon for like the handle. It's pretty bad.
But that's interesting. It seems that so in history, cultural snobbery, right? The way that it was sort of enacted in social hierarchies, right? There was a way to convey status when you had like this really expensive bottle of wine, this, you know, Hennessy, whatever, you name it, right? But it seems that that dynamic is shifting, right? And I was curious, what role do you think lowbrow culture is playing in that shift?
Yeah, well, again, I think we're in the middle of what I'm calling this shift or this status revolution. We're not at the end of it, so it's kind of hard to say. But I mean, clearly, when you have what are becoming widespread, I guess you could say social attacks, but at least widespread social questioning of who has status in this society, why they have it, what are the historical reasons for why they have it, what are some of the perhaps unjust reason for, you know, privilege. Often the words white male tend to go before privilege in our society, but not at all, by the way. These sort of questions that's a very localized phenomenon to the United States. I mean, privilege and status are being challenged all over the world, you know, in countries that aren't dominated by white males.
Yeah.
But I think when you are doing that, when somebody is at a perceived lower level of society than, you know, others that they are whose positions they are challenging, that they are going to start valuing the things that they have, the things that are important in their society, the things that might not cost a ton of money. This might be why, you know, ugly shoes are a sort of status symbol among some women. It might be why we see CEOs routinely showing up in the boardroom in a, you know, vintage Texas Rangers jersey or in, you know, shorts and t-shirts kind of thing.
Right. You call this counter signaling.
I don't, well, yeah, I didn't coin that phrase, but
Yeah.
for sure that's a term called counter signaling, wherein, you know, there's another thing going on here too, which is that a lot of, if you think about who are I'm getting this huge bright sunspike. Yes, it was in Portland, it's nice, bright and sunny here, but I'm getting this huge light on. You know, a lot of the people who have accumulated a lot of status in society now, who own the companies that are very important to us, are people from the 1960s and have carried their 1960s and 70s counterculture values with them their entire lives. And so these are people who have attained this sort of traditional markers of status, a lot of money, nice cars, big companies, whatnot, power and influence over society. And yet they are still carrying with them these values that were part of their social revolution and status revolution of the 1960s and 70s. And so they want to make sure that they are signaling to their peers that they have not sort of sold out, or they have not lost that value system that they were brought up in. And so that's a big part of what counter signaling is all about. You know, it's not being the man in the gray flannel suit, as the you know, I think it was a 1950s book anyway, but not being the three-piece suit guy, but you know, being the guy who can wear his t-shirt and his surfer board shorts into work if he so chooses. And now that those people are you know, in such high places in society, those fashion signals have transferred to most of us, right? So now it's pretty uncommon to see people going in most professions anyway, to see going to work dressed in a tie and a jacket. I'm talking about men here. So that's kind of part of the root of counter signaling.
Yeah, and
I
it
think
also,
there's kind of an interesting, weird little sidebar on that too, which is that, you know, rock star culture, which was just kind of dominated. I mean, the biggest heroes of the Cultural Revolution were rock stars, right, in the 60s, 70s, into the 80s. That's less so now, of course. But there, you know, the idea of the guys in Oasis or the Stones showing up and sitting in first class in their ripped jeans and, you know, reeking like bong water and having their old grotty t-shirt on was kind of this way for them to sort of announce that these values are now penetrating the culture and are becoming the more highly prized.
yeah, and that's what
it's super. Sorry, real quick sidebar. Just to, yeah, what the hell? That sucks, right? Because like rock, I grew up with that. It was so cool. Like always wanted to dress like, you know, like being a rock star or looking like a rock star was the coolest thing, you know, as far as that goes. And I don't know, I also resonated with the look of it. The thing now is more, it's kind of like rap, hip hoppy, you know, like that kind of vibe, which is cool. Don't get me wrong. I have an appreciation for it. It's just not something that like I resonate with. And I'm like, oh, what happened to rock? Like, I know it's still out there, but it's not like this mainstream thing anymore.
Yeah.
But whatever. I know we're not talking about music right now.
Yeah,
but
well, no, but that's actually, I'm going to piggyback off of that. So what's interesting about that, and this is something that I actually did want to talk about. So that status is when, we talked about the distinction between the good and the bad parts of it. Status is a good thing, as you mentioned with your story about the totem pole. So the idea is that you can take status and you could take marginalized groups and you could bring them sort of up, right? So a good example of this, since you guys brought up music, right? So sort of people like in kind of more impoverished areas, like let's say like Black culture, right? This is a great example. So like things that Black people normally would wear, like let's say, I don't know, late 80s, right, early 90s or whatever. So that kind of became popularized. And why I sort of like that is, well, first of all, I dress like that all the time, right? But why I also like that is because it's taking this thing that's automatically like low class or lowbrow, right? Sort of gutter wear, what some people will call, like, they're like, oh, that's for like those people in the ghetto or whatever. And it's making it popularized. So what's great about that is that you have marginalized groups of working class people, essentially, that in some way or another, they find their ways, or they find ways to raise their status by in some ways popularizing like some like brands and obviously types of clothes and whatever it is that they wear, songs that they sing, whatever, right? But I guess the problem is that when it becomes corporatized, and then of course corporations pick up on this, and now it becomes like, oh great, rich people are doing this shit too, and they're dressing like they're from the projects, right? So how do we kind of make sense of this in terms of the evolution of it? Because on the one hand, right, we do want to lift up marginalized groups, but on the other hand, because when it gets kind of corporatized, you're like, okay, great, now we want nothing to do with this anymore because it's sort of been co-opted. So how do we kind of make sense of it, or can we even keep like trends pure? Is that even a possibility?
I doubt it's a possibility. I think it's probably just cyclical. One of the things you said, and I touched on it pretty briefly, is hip hop producer Hype Williams and Puff Daddy at the time, but Sean Combs were really instrumental in there's the quote in the book. I tried to talk to Hype Williams, but I couldn't get an interview with him, but I picked up some other things that he said, included them in the book about, he said when I started looking at hip hop videos, rap videos as a kid, they all looked they were all shot in junkyards and, abandoned streets and garbage, because I wanted to take this. So like he takes, right, him and Puffy start shooting things in mansions in the Hamptons are using those sets. It's like, let's elevate the game here, right? And I think he did sort of exactly what you said, Leon. I mean, he like really took this as a vehicle for uplifting the rap world or the hip hop culture and making it, cool and giving it status, I would say, by placing it in the same way that the guys in Oasis showed up drunken in their ripped jeans in first class and caused a fight. He placed it right in the mansion of the Hamptons, right? And put those some of those videos there and really flashy. So I think that happened. Now, in terms of that gets kind of to Stephen Quartz's book, Cool, about, once a trend kind of takes over, becomes corporatized. Well, but here's the deal, right? Rebellion, which is often called disruption now, same thing, really. That's part of a revolution, right? So these revolutions are always have an element of rebellion to them. And the people at the spearhead of that are always going to be the cool ones. They're the ones starting the game. Most people are too afraid to be, or are too disinterested to be part of a cultural revolution or a status revolution. So the people at the forefront of it are always going to be kind of the leaders and the cool ones. And then the masses will follow along. And then at some point, it gets corporatized and people are going to start to rebel against it. So I don't think, to answer your question, there's necessarily an antidote to it. I don't think there needs to be. I don't necessarily think it's bad that a trend gets played out, or something that started at the bottom, started at the bottom, now we're here to extend your hip hop thing, is necessarily a bad thing. It's just, again, I'm not trying to place value judgments on any of this stuff. I'm just trying to kind of report on it and write what I see from the influencers. And so I think that's just going to happen. I started the book on a chapter on rescue dogs. And, the other thing that got me started on this whole project was this idea of rescue dogs, which now I want to separate just for the moment, this idea that rescue dogs are a means of virtue signaling for their owners, which they are, of course. But that wasn't the part of the rescue dogs that interested me. What interested me was that rescue dogs, their ascension within the dog world is fucking phenomenal, right? If I'm thinking of when I was a kid, there was no such thing as rescue dogs. They were pound dogs. They were stray dogs. They were rounded up by the dog catcher, and a needle was stuck into them about a week later if somebody had claimed them at the dog pound. That's what their value was to society. that's where they were within the hierarchy of dogs, of pet dogs. They were nobodies, man. They were at the bottom. So I sat there and thought, well, how in the hell did these, the least likely, the most devalued members of that community get elevated to this point so quickly that owning them is a means of virtue signaling, that they are now, I mean, there are laws on the books in most states that kind of protect rescue dogs. In the US Army, if you want to live on base housing now, you have to, and you want a dog, that dog has to be a rescue dog. It doesn't mean you have to, if you live off the base or whatever, you can have whatever dog you like. But if you want to have that right there, California has all sorts of laws protecting rescue animals. So I really wanted to look at, well, how did that happen? First of all, I was looking at, where did this term rescue dog come from? It's just kind of it just popped up and we all know it suddenly. So I tried to trace that. It's really hard. I spent a lot of time and nobody knows for sure. That term has actually been around since at least the 70s, but it didn't gain a lot of cachet until this woman named Kim Sterla out at the Marin Humane Society in the Bay Area in California started using it and applying it to a marketing campaign that she began in like the 1990s. So anyway, I can't remember what your question was. I think it was essentially about, oh, I know. Right, rescue dogs now, I think we could probably say we're at the, maybe at the height, we're just at the zenith of the popularity or the importance of rescue animals, I think. Maybe a little more, maybe some, but they haven't replaced bred dogs or kennel dogs, really. And this is another point I like to get to in the book, which I kind of wanted to touch on earlier about 10 minutes ago, which is that when you were talking about what are some of the downsides of status, what are some of the negative parts of it, I actually don't think there's that many, but I think that what this status revolution, the main point of this is that status has traditionally been viewed as a zero-sum game. If I have status, that means you don't have as much. Or if Alan suddenly has a lot of status, that means I have to lose mine. Or Leon, you have to lose yours a little bit. If one of the two of you becomes the more popular, becomes the Lionel Richie of this podcast. And the other guy's like, well, fuck, I'm doing just as much here. I'm the whole Commodores. But status doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. And that's what's being pitched by marketers. That status is for everyone. That's this weird oxymoron that's at the foundation of this new kind of drive for status. And so I might leave it to you to tell me what the negative parts of status are, other than maybe excessive pride.
So what's interesting is, so as far as creating sort of an equitable cultural landscape, as far as that goes, it is actually kind of interesting that marketers are creating that sort of illusion that you could get status in all these different kinds of ways. But actually, I could see that in a way, right? Like if somebody else has status because, let's say, they're rich, they have a Bugatti, they have the mansion, all that. Well, okay, well, this is just an example, but I play video games, I'm #1 in this particular hierarchy, or my friends think I'm really good and therefore I'm really popular amongst my friends. And even though that doesn't equate wealth and that that social value, at least as far as that dopamine in your brain or how your brain lights up in that MRI scan, it's not equal, but you're getting something from that. And it's interesting. So if you can't excel in this one hierarchy, you could just go to another one. And there's so many different niches now that somebody can go to, especially with the advent of social media and all these different meetup groups and all of that. I wonder if maybe there is, I mean, it does sound like we are getting very divided.
Can I add something to that?
Sure. Let me just finish this real quick point. So it does sound like we're getting divided, right? In terms of having a one view of what's popular and what's not popular, or what conveys status and what doesn't. So there is a sort of division taking place.
Sure.
But from another perspective, because there's all these different avenues where you can gain status from, I wonder what the potential is in that, in terms of that equitable cultural landscape. Maybe there is some hope for less comparing, because I can't advance in this hierarchy, right. I'm just going to go to this other one, maybe. But that's just
Yeah. So I would add, so in terms of also popularity, it's incredibly hard for us to predict like what will and won't work. So corporations don't really know, right? So they just say like, okay, here are the trends and we're just going to keep up with them or whatever. So since we were talking about rap music, I really love this as an example because this is like the plot of the new season of the WuTang Show on Hulu, called An American Saga. So what's so cool is that like there are these kind of pivotal moments in the show where they try to figure out like, okay, do we do like this corporate thing or do we try to kind of go off on our own and do sort of the stuff for the streets, right? The stuff that like just regular people will love. And so what's interesting in the show is that, and this is obviously a true story, is you have like Rizzo where he starts off, so he was, what was it, Prince Rakeem, right? So he was like pretty much like every rapper in the 80s at the time. He was signed to Tommy Boy Records. And then so they told him like, hey man, like, we're not going to bring your crew with you. You're the guy that we want, right? So, he has this like kind of a internal struggle. Like, what do I do? Do I bring my friends with me or do I try to do this thing on my own and maybe like bring them along later on? So, okay, so he doesn't do that, right? He doesn't take them with him. So he becomes Prince Rakeem. So it's the same sort of cookie cutter, like generalized music. He's like rapping for girls. He's like, this shit is stupid. I don't look like this. I don't dress like this. Like, I don't want to do this, right? So essentially it doesn't work out. And so he's like, what the fuck? He's like, I kind of sacrificed my soul or, what I thought was real or genuine or whatever for this, right? And it didn't work out. And so essentially Tommy Boy Records is like, yo, look, sorry, kid. Like, we try to do what we could for you. And, it's kind of over now. And so now Rizzo's pissed off and he's like, yo, fuck this. He's like, the next time I do this, he's like, not only am I taking the entire crew with me, but we're going to do what we want to do. We're going to sing what we want to sing. We're going to put out records on our own. We're just going to figure this shit out. And like what people like, if it hits and it becomes popular, great. And if not, he's like, I'm never going to go through this shit again. And you see this trend in rap music from like DMX, Tupac is a big one where he said something like, I'm not writing songs for like the people who will like listen to them and then put them down the next day. I'm literally writing it for the kid that lives a thug life and feels like it's hopeless. So my point is to say that popularity is unpredictable. And with corporations, all they're doing is just following trends. And often what you see is that when you are kind of a disruptor or a rebeller or whatever you want to kind of call it, when you do go against the grain and you're presenting something to people, and now we're back to the beginning of the podcast, where you're presenting real art, like art that actually touches people's everyday experiences, that speaks to them and lets them feel heard, that shit oftentimes, man, becomes way more popular than any of those trends. And that's kind of the point of the WuTang Show. It's like when you hear these records and you're like, oh shit, like this is my everyday life. This is what I want to listen to. I don't want to listen to like, corporate sponsored music or whatever. And then, yeah, you sort of find that, essentially there's this other way of doing it. And then, yeah, it's not a zero-sum game. You'll have like guys like Drake or whatever. These people are always going to be popular, but then you're always going to have rappers that literally come out of nowhere. And it's again, because they speak to everyday experiences.
And just super quick,
sure.
Are you also in that? I could almost gauge, because there was that question Chuck asked where what do you think are the negative implications of status seeking? That's interesting, because in what you just said, people who are status seeking and not necessarily creating from themselves or creating culture, consuming culture rather, it sounds like they're sacrificing their soul just to gain status.
Yeah, I love that. And then also the other thing, and this is, I would say if there's a big downside, this is where the WuTang Show touches on, or this is what the WuTang Show touches on, right? So initially Bobby, so there is a character, so Bobby wanted to do something that was for people. He's like, the point is to save our culture for our people, right? And that's now, as the show is coming to an end, that's what they keep talking about, right? Like, how do we keep, or how do we prevent these companies from stealing Black culture? Because this is ours for us, that's the kind of FUBU brand. And so for them, the idea was that I'm producing music for people to show them that they matter, that their voices are heard, and that their voices deserve a platform. When you are sacrificing that, and when you become a Prince Rakeem, right, and you're just making like songs for like, women to get laid or whatever, essentially now you no longer care about the community. It's not important to you. So now you're seeking status for the sole purpose of seeking status. Whereas I know, and you're big on this, right, just like with our podcast, I would hope that this is what we're doing, and I know you definitely are, is that we're doing the podcast for another end. And like, look, if the status comes with it, great, but it's the podcast for like the community or the culture or whatever. And that's what I love about rap music, is that essentially the status comes after the fact, but that's not the purpose of what they're doing.
Well, I thought as you guys were talking, and I hadn't thought of it before, but particularly in the music business, but with a lot of trends, right? The people that are the disruptors, real quick sidebar, you're cool if you're a rebel or a disruptor, if you're successful at it. Right? If you're not successful at it, you're the worst. But if you're a successful disruptor, right, basically you are, in a lot of ways, chasing the money. But what you're saying, I hear you saying, is that once you attain that money, you're starting to lose your cachet a little bit within that community. And so that presents a pretty big conundrum. I like that you're talking about music. You know, you mentioned at the top that I did this documentary for Paramount Plus called Sometimes When We Touch, which is the sort of history of soft rock. And that just came out recently, so I feel okay to talk about it. But, you know, one of the things I thought was really interesting and that I did want to explore in that show was here were these musicians in the 70s and 80s, from the Carpenters to Captain and Tennille to Air Supply to Dan Hill, who wrote Sometimes When We Touch. Huge commercial success. I mean, these guys are outselling Led Zeppelin and CCR and Hendrix and the Ramones and the Sex Pistols by Barry Manilow. All you hear about is the Sex Pistols and Ramones. Barry Manilow sold 50 times more records than those two combined in half of their career, right? And yet,
Wow.
at the same time, they had this huge commercial success. They were completely belittled by critics. Even, you know, by radio DJs were spinning their records and, you know, teeing them up with a shitty intro, you know, you're not more cheese from the Cheese King, you know, Anne Murray or whatever, you know, that kind of stuff. So it was this weird paradox for me that I really wanted to get into in that show that I think you're kind of touching on here, which is huge commercial profitability and success. And suddenly you don't have this status within your community anymore, even though prior to your ascension to that level, monetary, you know, being number one, having a number one record was supposedly what gave you all the status. And it's like, well, fuck, I got the number one record and now you're shitting on me, you know? And I don't know if there's a parallel there in the hip hop world or not. I talked to, not for soft rock, I wouldn't consider Rick Springfield soft rock, but I interviewed him once some years ago. And he told me, he goes, I have experienced being at the top of my game professionally on every magazine cover. My song was everywhere and making money and being disrespected at the same time.
Yeah.
It really did a mind fuck on me. I don't know that he used that term, but that's basically what he said.
Mm-hmm.
It is interesting in the music world, in particular, entertainment, when somebody breaks off. You know, I used the Lionel Richie example before. I mean, it worked out for him, and yet, you know, nobody ever slagged off on Lionel was with the Commodores, but when he, you know, gained this huge elevated success, he was suddenly this super uncool guy getting memed for hello and things like that.
Right. Yeah. And what's so interesting about music is that, like, it's sort of a thin line, because on the one hand, you do want to have like collaborations and you want to, you know, do music with people who are already super famous and popular. But yeah, that does like lose some credibility for you, especially like for hip hop, especially. I don't know about maybe for other genres, maybe not. But for hip hop, well, actually, no, like for punk rock, totally. Right. Especially for punk, you know, if you're doing collaborations, yeah, with like, you know, some of the top singers, I mean, people are going to be like, wow, dude, like you fucking sold out. So it's sort of this thin line. Yeah.
Do they still, is that term, you know, in that doc, Dan Hill talked about that term sold out. Is that term still pretty prevalent, do you think? Or is that, I mean, that was a term that I used to hear
I
all
still
the
hear it.
time. You do?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
people are
yeah.
still sort of looked down upon for selling out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
It's
would
pretty
say,
interesting
Actually,
that-
you know, no, you're right. You're right. I haven't heard that in a while. Like Metallica, you know, or you know, oh, like this band is selling out because they signed with, or they're like, I forgot. Was it Napster?
but that was ages ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, technically, I don't know if the term is used, but yeah, it's still thought of, because if you think about it, there's a certain community that propels you forward, right? So if it's hip hop, right, you have, you know, your sect demographic, and then the same thing with punk. And yeah, they don't like that. So the idea is like, hey, we don't listen to this music. We don't buy your albums, or, you know, in this case, MP3s or whatever, to listen to this, right? So when you're making duets with Mariah Carey, that's not what we were hoping for. That's not why we kind of help propel you to the top. So I think there's sort of, and this happens with sports too, you know, there's sort of an allegiance to a fan base that helps you, you know, that kind of propels you upward. So that's why it's such a thin line.
You know what? You know, when was the last time I heard the term sellout? But it wasn't music related. It was, and I don't know how many people think this, but Joe Rogan, for example, when he signed on with Spotify,
yeah, I
some.
think there,
My
well,
bad.
I would maybe argue a little bit that I think the stigma around commercial success is not as great as it might have been. You know, that was the whole story of the alternative rock scene in the 80s, you know, bands like REM and the Replacements. And, you know, when would one jump to a major, right? It was all these indie labels, and, you know, the Replacements were on Twin Tone, this cool label out of Minneapolis, and REM was with their guys down in Athens, and Sub Pop, you know, started as just a little, you know, bedroom Seattle thing. But it was like, I think it was when REM signed on to Warner for the first, first of those indie alt rock, college rock, big bands that went major label. That was a big deal, right? That was this big sellout moment. But REM just got more popular. They transcended it, and their music, maybe by some accounts, even got better. So I don't know. I feel like that stigma is a little bit less than it was at sellout. But your Joe Rogan example is a pretty good one. I hadn't thought of that.
I guess, yeah, and even then, that one's a sort of a gray zone. Just some people thought
Sorry,
that because they were like,
it wasn't his like the big early success anyway. Was on a network reality show, right? Wasn't it the
Fear Factor?
Fear Factor. But then
So
the
he was
podcast.
at least he came on Joe Rogan's really interesting in that career trajectory, because at least in my mind, I first became aware of him as the host of Fear Factor, in which, in my viewing, he appeared like, okay, just another sort of cheesy, over the top, exaggerated host of one of these unscripted reality shows. And I was like, okay, whatever. I don't know who this guy is, but he's just some network, hype guy. But then he kind of, I don't know, he found this other community and has built an entirely different reputation than that, for better or worse. I mean, I know some people love him, some people don't, but I happen to like Joe Rogan, or at least be entertained by him. I've never met him. I don't know if I like him, but I like his public persona entertains me in the same way, Howard Stern's does.
Yeah, real quick aside. So speaking of Howard Stern, there was a show called Opie and Anthony before that was kind of like Howard Stern, but it was a little bit more of like a hang type show. So they'd have on comedians all the time. And so they would just shoot the shit, talk about whatever, and comedians would tell the best stories. People get really honest, deep, emotional. It wasn't like bits like that they do on a radio show. So it felt very raw and real. And probably the appeal, so Rogan would appear, for example, on that Opie and Anthony show, and people started getting exposure to him. And then he started copying the guy Anthony from the show, doing like some kind of a live stream. And then that's how his podcast started. He started just live streaming him talking with his friends, just shooting the shit, kind of copying that Opie and Anthony format. And then it just grew and grew and grew and grew. Advertisers came on eventually as the audience grew. And then eventually he just shot up so high that like Spotify's like, hey, here's $100 million or $200 million a year contract. And yeah, he's like now like a thought leader essentially, basically, right. And controversial too, but that's inevitable, right? You're going to say something to a mass group of people, of course it's going to be polarizing. And
he has some responsibility for that too.
No, I'm just being general, right?
Like
you say anything, and if me and you started talking, even if you said the most nuanced version of trying to explain something like even nice, like you should be good to people or something, somehow somebody is gonna have a problem.
But that's not the case with Rogan, though.
I'm just saying. I'm not trying to. Okay, well, we're getting off of the book right now. We're getting into Rogan.
It's interesting. I want to ask you about Opie and Anthony. I know that show, but was it syndicated? Was that a radio show? Because I've heard that show, and I don't know. Did they have some deal on Comedy Central for a while? I know I've been exposed to Opie and Anthony.
They were syndicated through in New York through WNEW, and then
I must have been in some market and heard them.
And then got onto Sirius XM, and then where Howard is currently. Then the host of that show said some really horrible, controversial stuff on Twitter. I can't believe I'm talking about this. Anthony Cumia, and then the whole show got canceled, and it's a different iteration now on Sirius XM.
Maybe that's where I know them from. So no, I love talking. I mean, I started in radio until I realized I did not have a radio. I didn't have I had the radio face, but not the radio voice. So I got
Well, as we just start wrapping up, another point that I really wanted to focus on. So in terms of, we talked about some of the downsides of status, right? So excessive pride, right, or narcissism. So this is sort of what happens when the culture is obsessed with status. You sort of you overcompensate, right? You take things that shouldn't necessarily represent or mean as much as they do, and you kind of blow them up, and you even exaggerate some of your achievements, right? So you talk about the kind of correlation between sports cars and penis size, and I really love that, right? So because what that tells you is that, so this is sort of remember that Dave Chappelle skit where it was like something gone real, where it's like this is when going real goes horribly wrong, right? So that's what I kind of think of, right? So this is like when static C goes wrong, right? So when we start doing things like this, so can we talk about that?
Yeah, we can. So that I think that chapter's sort of both helped and hurt the book a little bit. I mean, essentially, what I the, so I commissioned a study, an academic study, with a professor, sociologist out at University College London in England. I act like I'm out in London all the time. To take on this well-known, joke or trope or whatever, that guys who drive sports cars or flashy cars are doing so to compensate for a smaller than average penis, right? We all know that joke. There's not a person on earth that doesn't realize that. I mean, Greta Thunberg just made that little clap back, on her Twitter, to the guy right in January or something, who said, "Oh, Greta, check out my 12 Ferraris," and
Andrew Tate, yeah.
even hashtag small dick energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's how widespread that thing. But I thought, well, how do we do it? Does anybody really know that? Has anybody ever really tried to put some academic study to show whether that was true or not? And my reason for doing that was I thought it would be kind of a funny little study to do. But really what I wanted to do with that study, and as I alluded to earlier, I think one of the pushers of this status revolution is academia, and the way that status is studied, who it's studied by, how the studies are carried out. And so what I really wanted to do was kind of get an inside look at the world of academia. And, you see these things where it's like, my favorite example is well, whatever, I wouldn't get into that, but, researchers have found that, prehistoric man, preferred fish over veal. I don't know what, whatever. 2 and 3, prehistoric people were bisexual or something like that, right? You'll see that. So I really wanted to see how these studies are carried out. And that was the interesting part of that to me. So I got a hold of this Professor Daniel Richardson at University College London, who's known for doing these kind of eclectic and hot studies, convinced him somehow to go along with this. And so we did it, and we got a team of student researchers who all turned out to be women from 3 different countries, which wasn't planned that way. It's just who answered our job posting. But I think it's pretty typical of, 30 years ago, you would not have, if you were trying to study male genitalia, you would not have the sort of cohort that we had that was studying it, right? And so the questions they came up with differed, the conclusions they came up with. What we ended up finding was that it turned out that men who at least thought or perceived themselves to have a smaller than average penis were drawn to sports cars and flashy cars more often than men who were not in the same penis threatened condition, which is
scientific evidence.
I know I really loved it just because all this academic terminology, and they put this penis threatened condition on it. So we tried to put guys in a penis threatened condition and then sort of find out if what sort of consumer goods they were most attracted to as a result. I mean, it's whatever, right? So that was the study. And of course, that's been lambasted in circles as being very sophomoric or juvenile undertaking by me. I feel like but it's bullshit. It's not. I mean, men Google, and the penis is the most Googled body part in all of Google searches, right? Men clearly care about it. And men clearly care about the size of their penis in comparison to other guys. I mean, that's just a fact. And so to think that it's sophomoric to sort of wonder why that is, or to sort of try to put some academic study behind it, feels sophomoric to me, to make fun of that. So, it's funny, that study and that chapter's got a ton of publicity. I've done a ton of interviews in Europe, a Swiss car magazine and a German magazine and an Irish radio station. And I just did a thing with the Italian La Repubblica newspaper about that. The American reaction to that chapter and study seems to be embarrassed by it, or to say it's shit and it's stupid, but the Europeans seem to like it a lot.
Yeah, we're pretty uptight here.
That works.
Uptight.
No, I mean, hey, any press, it's good. It's good press as far as Europe goes.
And it's also an important study. I mean, we're talking correlations. Like, why shouldn't we know about these things? And also, I mean, it's fucking obvious. Like, these studies already probably reinforce common sense anyway. So why is this problematic?
And plus, people. Oh yeah, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, to me, it was really about being involved in the process. I could have chosen any sort of study to do. I found it funny, and I thought other people might find it funny or eye catching or something. But anyway. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Alan.
no, no, I think that it's just if people here are reacting to it, right? I still feel that's good. It's better than indifference, right? At least they care, they do care about it. If they're going to say something, if they say something negative about it, it's still a form of emotion investment in the writing. So technically it's a net positive, although I would agree you would prefer, I mean, me too, like, you know, somebody saying something good about that chapter versus something bad, but I don't
Well,
know. I think it's
it is
fine.
a really interesting thing to me too, in that, right, we've always traditionally looked at cars, expensive cars, a Lamborghini or your Testarossa or, you know, Ford Mustang, vintage, whatever, as a status symbol. I mean, cars emerged in the 20th century as really the ultimate status symbol, particularly for males, right? I mean, you could have $1 million mansion, but you couldn't park it downtown or drive it around and show everybody, right? I mean,
You're
so
right.
this when cars were invented, this kind of combination of scientific technology, of money, you know, they're expensive, of a flash of aesthetic appeal, of wealth, of mobility, which was really valued, right, as the 19th century turned to 20th century. It just became this pinnacle of the status symbol. And yet at the most base form of guy status symbols is guys, right, when they're kids checking out other guys in a locker room or something. I mean, that just
Sure.
happens, and it does kind of establish this weird hierarchy, or this anxiety, this status anxiety that guys will have. Well, wow, maybe I will not be as attractive to the girls in my school now because of, you know, my inadequacy here. So it kind of is, what to me was this marriage of almost the most lowest form or base form of status anxiety, status seeking, and at what one time at least was a really, and still is, a very high, you know, expensive part of status seeking.
Yeah, and for a lot of men, I mean, this is like the horrible part, and I know we didn't really get into this too much. This is like now going into clinical territory. So status seeking becomes, you know, we talked a little bit about obsession, but it becomes such an obsessive drive where everything that you get, even relationships, are just a symbol of your status. So it's not, you know, I'm meeting this girl because maybe I like her, I want to have a family or whatever. It's the family is an indicator of status, her appearance, who she is in the kind of community or whatever, how she's valued. That's an indicator of status. And so for those people, they're so kind of self-absorbed, and this is the huge, probably the biggest downside of status, is that when again it becomes an end in itself, that nothing else really matters to you, and you don't really form intimate bonds with other people because again it's just a means to an end.
Right. Yeah, ego and status
Yeah.
sort of go hand in hand, right? Like you identify with the things that you have, your place in society. What does this mean to other people? Who am I in relation to all these others?
Yeah.
And then anything that deviates from that will cause you to react in all sorts of ways or feel lower emotions. And it's like this thing that if you care about can really play with your psyche, essentially, and also distract you from the things that might really matter, like to your point,
Yeah.
right? Like actually genuinely seeking those things for themselves rather than
Yeah, and that
for status.
right, and that's why we kind of we gave the example of like music, right? Because the point really of music is to connect with other people. I mean, ultimately, you know, and I know this is maybe like purity or whatever, but that's kind of what it is, right? We want to put out music, like I write, right? So I write because I want my audience to identify with it and say, oh shit, like I see myself in it, and I'm really grateful you put that out. But yeah, man, it's like status and the way it corrupts. Like it's sort of again when it becomes then in itself, you stop really caring too much about how people react unless it's again it sort of propels you forward. And so that kind of happens with narcissism. Yeah.
But if any impulse, if uncontrolled, can lead to problems, right? I mean,
Yes.
maybe one of the things in the value of this discussion that we're having, or perhaps somebody might find some value of that in my book, is to understand these impulses and where they come from and why we have them and what value they do have, why they are important, or at least why they are inevitable anyway
Yep.
in society. But I mean, a guy or woman, you can do anything too much, right?
Yes.
You know, so
That's fair. Yeah, there's a utility to
yeah,
status,
so I
right?
think
Like,
this thing that
yeah,
going after status and it leads to all these terrible things. Well, yeah, it does if you do it to excess.
yeah, that
If
makes
you
sense. Yeah.
drink caffeine too much. I mean, you know, one cup of coffee, or you might like to tea, fine. But if I'm drinking 8 cups of coffee a day, that's gonna really fuck with my physiology, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and
Or
I think that And I think the thinking here is that status has to be just one component of what makes up a good life. Now we're going into philosophy a little bit here. So the idea is like, yeah, everybody needs status. Like obviously we see, again, going back to psych studies, is that people who are of low status and who do have low self-esteem tend to have poor outcomes mental health wise, and they should, right? So I think the thinking is like, what we talked about earlier, what you said, Chuck, is that it's not a zero-sum game. So we need some degree of status and we need to feel like we're an important member of our community. But yeah, the idea is that we have like, these other things that we focus on, like, again, relationships, for podcasters, right? Connecting to the community in an educational way. If you're a therapist or whatever, helping people in that way or whatever. If you're a writer, sort of relating to people, helping them see that their voices are heard. So the point is to say that, yeah, you're right. Status in itself is never a good or a bad. It's pretty much its utility and how it's used. So.
Well, where do you guys, I have one point I want to make because you made me think of something, but I mean, your podcast is really interesting week to week or month to month, how often you do it. Where does status kind of fit into what you two see as the mission of this podcast?
I love this.
Why are we talking about? Why am I here?
I love this question because, he and I actually kind of disagree on it.
Yeah, we were talking about this before the podcast.
Yeah.
And like one of his patients said to him, like, oh, that's great. You have a podcast. So you're trying to be a thought leader, or you're a thought leader, right? And then like we're talking about it. And he's like, yeah, so that would be our status, right? We're trying to be thought leaders and influencers, right?
Yeah.
And then I start to like disagree. I'm like, no, not really. Like, I don't know. Like, I just want to like help people and stuff like that, and then help lead their thought. And then I was joking though, right? Because then he's like, that's a thought leader.
Yeah.
No, I mean, yeah, I suppose that just already being a podcaster confers some sort of status, I guess, versus like your non-podcaster friends. Like if they're like, oh, you're a podcaster, that's cool. What's your podcast about? Cool. And then like you get some kind of something from that, which is great.
Yep.
But then of course there's still a hierarchy within podcasting where you're like, oh, what's my podcasting level versus that podcaster versus that one. But then where I get into like trying not to care about it is like
he resists.
I don't know. It's like I feel like if you care about it, it distracts from the art of it. Like you almost want to do as best of a job as you can.
Yeah.
So that feels like the main.
But okay, so for me, why I'm always mindful about status and how we compare to other podcasts is because I'm always asking, like, what makes us special? How do we differentiate from the pack, right? So for me, status is important, not just as a means into it, a means in itself, right? Because it definitely is. I mean, I'm sorry, an end to it, and then in itself, obviously, it's gonna be, but also because it sort of gets us, kind of publicity, right? So it gets us publicity, it gets us an audience, it gets us viewers, and the idea is most importantly to me is that our ideas to get taken seriously. So what I find is that if we are going to compete in the podcasting realm, and that is what we are doing, I know you hate that, but we are competing. So we have to have our ideas taken seriously. And the only real way to do that is to obviously at least care about what they are and to work on them and to maybe not necessarily consider yourself as a thought leader, but to strive for it.
What if we're not competing? We're collaborating.
With who?
Other podcasts and authors and guests.
I mean,
it's all collaboration.
Yeah.
I probably relate a little more to Alan's point of view. Even coming on these shows causes me a little stress and anxiety. I don't like the idea that I have to be as I wrote this thing. Most writers become writers because they're introverts and they do best sort of sitting at a keyboard or writing in a journal or something quietly alone. And that typically is how I am. I've kind of trained myself to be a little bit more extroverted on things like this or talk, but I'm never comfortable with it. Alan, I've got a quote. I should look it up. It's either Sylvia Plath or Emily Dickinson who said, "Publishing is not the business of poets." Basically meaning that you just write your poem. I don't want to worry about selling the fucking thing. I don't want to worry about edits or packaging or talking about it. Right? It's just, I'm just here to write my poem and put it out in the world, and you love it and lap it up like little kittens at a saucer of milk, right? Unfortunately, in our world, so I have to give a point to Leon here. We all know you can have the greatest idea in the world, and if you don't promote it, it's going nowhere. My book might be great, it might suck, but no one's going to know the difference if I don't kind of compete, as Leon said.
Yeah, and my one like sort of slight criticism to the both of you would be that you guys are either paying for or you're getting the publicity somehow, right? So yes, you might not be the one self-promoting, quote unquote, but somebody's doing the promotion for you.
Oh yeah, sorry. Real quick point. I
Yeah.
am aware that there's an importance to, of course, marketing,
Yeah.
and people are not going to, see you need them to see your stuff. There is a metrics based
Yeah.
aspect to this. It's just that I would like to just lean more towards like, I just want to concentrate on the art and the writing and the,
Let me check. Guess who does the promotion? So, but
a little bit.
Are you guys? Are you familiar with the Canadian novel? Well, he's not more than a novelist, Canadian writer named Robertson Davies. He died in the 90s. He wrote these great, he's widely considered, if not the greatest, I guess Margaret Atwood now, but one of the greatest Canadian writers, novelists. He wrote a lot of stage plays. I really love, he wrote a lot about ego and these Freudian kind of things, but just really just about our egos and our sense of self and worth and how we get that, how we attain that. I interviewed him. I was shortly before he died, and I asked him. I said, "Well, do you have a big ego? What's your assessment of your ego?" The story's not as great if you're not a Robertson Davies fan, but he did definitely admit that he had a very well developed ego and that he fed it and this and that. He was very candid about all that. Anyway, maybe after I'll dig up one of the 20 Robertson Davies books I have and send you a title or two, because he was really wrote a book. I think it was called the Deptford Trilogy. And I know the first part of that, which I forget the name of I think the second one was a book called The Manticore, that he really got into these kind of themes. And he was really, really brilliant, super smart guy about it. But one thing to get back to this whole the status revolution and this sort of zero-sum game and the problems of status. I often think about that couple in St. Louis a few summers ago, standing on their front lawn of their mansion, waving their automatic, or the guy did anyway, in his pink polo shirt or whatever, at the social justice marchers, protesters going by, right? He felt really threatened by that, clearly, having to come out on your lawn with an automatic or something, right, to do that. But I think that's a guy that's classically misreading what this status revolution is all about and the paradigm it seeks to overturn. It does not mean that because I am demanding some status or that I am attaining some new level of status, that you have to lose yours. That doesn't mean that your place in society is going to suffer just because my own is elevated. And that's a really hard concept for people to get their heads around, because we have always looked at status as this, as we said, I've got status, you don't. Oh, you've got some now, I don't have as much. That's not how it works. But for basically all of human societies, as I said, Western society, that's how we've tended to think of status. But that's the basic paradigm and the shift that I think that this status revolution is seeking to overturn. Yeah. And I think most people really misread it.
Yeah. And I would just end it off on this note. In terms of like just psychoanalytic territory, what we would say is that it's not that these dark impulses or darker, shadows or whatever. So it's not that they're bad, right? Like sort of status seeking. They only get bad.
You just called it dark. You said it was a dark impulse.
So all right, let me be clear. I don't mean that in terms of morality. Here's what I mean by dark. So okay, I'm going to define it. Okay, so what we mean by dark is just we mean by unconscious, right? So something that's sort of yeah. So what we mean is something that's unacknowledged, right? That's what I mean by dark, right? So Jung calls this the shadow, right? It's not that it's bad or good or whatever. We're not thinking about it moralistically. We're just thinking about it as something that's sort of like projected outward, right? So yeah. So when I'm thinking about so in terms of psychoanalysis, the idea is that these darker sort of impulses, that it's not that they're good or bad, but the point is to say that when you're in denial of them, right, then they become uncontrollable, right? Sort of you're doing these things and you're sort of, again, unacknowledged, and you're kind of in denial of them, and they run roughshod, right? Sort of they're like all over the place, and you don't control them because you're not really aware of them. And so, again, going into the kind of psychoanalytic tradition, what they would say is it's not that this thing is either good or bad in itself. It's pretty much like, what is it kind of doing to you, or how is it affecting your life? So, a psychoanalyst would say, well, you should probably acknowledge it and accept this. And I would argue you should too, my friend, is that we care about promotion, right? That we care about promoting ourselves, we care about status. But yes, the idea is the more we acknowledge it, the less it sort of controls us, as opposed to, us controlling it. So, all right, Alan, final questions for Chuck before we wrap up.
Yes. Where can we follow you, and where can we buy the book?
Well, I'm pretty easy to follow at chuckthompson.com. So there was the only other famous Chuck Thompson out there was a Baltimore Orioles baseball announcer, and he often comes up first on your search. But if you just go chuckthompson.com, that's me. Book is, well, shoot, I don't know. It's in some brick and mortar stores, I guess, in the chains and whatnot, and your nicer independent stores might have ordered it. But it's put out by Simon and Schuster, so it's pretty available on anywhere that you buy books online. I don't have a preference. I'm not down on certain sellers as some people are, but I won't, it's easy to find at anywhere you buy books.
All right, Chuck, thank you so much for coming on, man. This was one of my favorite podcasts.
Fun podcast.
Yeah, it's a cool conversation. I enjoyed it, you guys. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. We'll talk to you soon.
All right.
All right. Awesome. So everyone, if you want to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter, where Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
hit the bell on YouTube.
And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.